If you'd stood by any empty country road on the edge of Missouri that stifling August night, you might have heard a distant howl far louder than the coyotes, mine, threading up from the heart of everything I knew, as orange flames finally peeled the painted boards of our family barn away from the past. People imagine tragedy's first blow is silence, but loss arrives heavy and shrieking, searing every mistaken memory you ever loved into the smoke. I was 16, stubborn as summer, still scrubbing dirt from knuckles after sunset chores, when the world that raised me vanished in less than an hour. My papa's voice had always carried through storms. He didn't blink at the thunder, but when the barn went up, he shrank behind hands gnarled by harvest, eyes full of horror as if all the ghosts we'd kept at bay had burst into wild flame. In the days before tractors and endless highways, that barn wasn't just lumber and hay. It was every wedding, birth, funeral, and bitter quarrel the Randall family had endured across 100 freezing winters and broiling Julys. They said we lost animals, the old green tack trunk, the only picture of my brother, but what burned was the proof of who we'd been, the evidence that our struggles made sense because there was something permanent at the center of it all. What no one could see was that the fire also set loose a fury in me, so deep it might have dried out the river itself. That night I promised I'd find out who or what took our past, no matter how long the road was or how alone I'd end up. Yet even revenge is a kind of faith. Mine threaded through every hour as I watched Mama rest-stitch charred quilts, and Papa limp to the blackened site, and sift ash as though love could turn cinders back to memory. By the next morning, rumors sparked louder than the flames. Was it the neighbor whose bad debt soured every Sunday handshake, or the drifter seen asking about old family feuds at the general store? With the barn's ashes still smoldering, I learned how quickly neighbors measured a girl's grief against their own unspoken fears, and how suspicion twists in the night like smoke you can't outrun. I stopped being a child that week. The fire didn't just take our roof and our stories. It forced me to sift through sorrow and suspicion alike, pushing past tears until all that remained was raw will. Some losses scatter you to the wind, but as the night stretched into that endless summer, I learned that pain, when faced, can become a forge. Mine would shape not just the bones of my future, but the backbone of a purpose as fiery and unyielding as the embers that ruined us. And there, on scorched earth where my childhood ended, I began the most dangerous journey of all, one that would hunt down the truth even as it cost me nearly everything. When the morning haze lifted after the fire, the landscape smelled like endings, sweet and sick with soot, and every crow that wheeled above the ruins sounded like gossip spreading through heaven itself. My father stared for hours at what once held our lives, the cracked foundation, the horses' blackened harness rings half sunk in ash, the iron latch Mama would polish on Sundays, but I couldn't bring myself to cry. The tears had burned out somewhere between the first spark and the last creak of collapsing beams. I touched the ground like someone tracing the lines of a gravestone, knowing this wasn't just a loss, but a theft, because barns don't simply ignite under moonlight without a cruel hand nearby. The sheriff called it accidental, some nonsense about lamp oil left open, but I saw the scorch pattern, the way flames had run deliberate along the grain, as though led by someone's careful fury. Deep in my bones, I sensed a betrayal older than my own grief. The Randalls had made enemies in small towns. Success was rarely forgiven. That winter Papa had refused to sell a share of our land to the Merritt brothers, men too rich to remember courtesy, but too small to forget insults. And after the fire, their laughter carried too easily down Main Street. My mother begged me to let it rest, said revenge eats what little joy tragedy leaves behind. But at night, when the wind hissed through blackened rafters, I'd see my brother Henry's grin in the smoke, the same grin frozen in the only photo that burst in the fire. He'd gone missing during the last war, never sent word home, and the barn had been the shrine to his memory. Losing it felt like losing him all over again, and the rage locked inside me began to whisper plans, quiet, dangerous thoughts about evening the scales. I was 17 when I rode out the first time before dawn, tracing boot prints around the charred site, studying the faint trail of kerosene drips like a language I had to learn. The trail curved toward the river, ending at a spot fishermen used for night fires, and buried in the mud I found something no accident would leave behind, a metal flask marked with the initials TM. That was Thomas Merritt's mark, the younger of the brothers, a man too clever to hammer his own nails and too proud to think anyone from the Randall farm could reckon with him. Holding that flask, my pulse steadied. Grief turned into something sharp enough to cut through fear. Over the months, as snow dusted the fields Papa refused to abandon, I began working in town at the feed store, partly to earn enough to rebuild, but mostly to listen. Gossip travels faster than truth, and through it I learned that Thomas Merritt had been late home the night of the fire, his wagon wheels still sooty come morning. Each rumor was a match tip against the barrel of my patience. Still, justice wasn't something a farm girl could buy with nickels, and righteousness meant little without proof. So I watched, waited, and learned how vengeance breathes. It doesn't rush, it coils. Every night I prayed for my mother's faith and my father's strength. But in my dreams I saw the barn burning again. And this time I wasn't crying. I was walking through the smoke, unafraid, carrying something no flame could destroy. The beginning of purpose, the will to make loss mean more than mourning, to make it speak. And one night by lamplight behind the store, I overheard what I'd waited months for. A drunken confession that would set in motion the vengeance I swore, and a reckoning that would mark every. It happened in the back room of Murphy's Feed and Grain, where the floor was always powdered with floury dust and spilled oats, and where men spoke freely once the whiskey cleared their shyness. I'd come to close the ledger when I heard Thomas Merritt bragging between hiccups to the blacksmith about a fire that solved a whole lot of pride. The blacksmith laughed, a low sound without humor, but I froze, my fingers gripping the counter as if stillness itself could hold the world from breaking open again. I remember the creak of his chair, the scrape of boots, and then his smug whisper, "She'll marry into dust now, if she's wise enough to survive it." That sentence carried more ruin than any flame. My breath left me in fragments, but I didn't reveal myself, not yet. I walked out into the frozen street and let the wind claw the tears from my face until they felt like knives. Revenge no longer whispered then, it sang. Over the next months, I began to edge closer to the Merritt estate under kind pretenses, helping deliver grain, mending linens for their housekeeper, asking quiet questions. Every errand was a seed of justice planted under the snow, waiting to bloom in spring. I learned their routines, the way Thomas drank on Thursdays, the way his older brother Samuel kept the books under lockbox, how their hired help feared them more than respected them. But most of all, I learned their fears. The deeper a family's pocket, the more fragile its secrets. My mother couldn't understand my restlessness. She thought I clung to loss because it was all I had left of Henry. Maybe she was partly right. Yet there was something else behind the ache. Pride forged through ruin. The knowledge that the only way to honor what we'd lost was to make our pain useful. Papa had fallen ill by then, coughing through nights, the fire having taken not only the barn, but his will to plant again. I nursed him, patched over his regrets, and each dawn promised him we'd rebuild when the thaw came, though I secretly saved every penny for something less noble, a reckoning sharp enough to slice through corruption itself. The first real chance came in early May, when heavy rains swelled the river and wiped out a pile of timber by the Merritt sawmill. Rumors said their insurance papers had been falsified before the flood, and Thomas, ever reckless, kept the originals in his study. So I devised a way in. Under the pretense of delivering mended linens, I carried a bundle wrapped around wax paper to keep the rain off and hid inside a ledge behind the fireplace until night shrouded the windows. I remember the silence, the occasional creak of wood, and the sound of my own breath trembling like the flame of the candle I dared not light. When his boots thudded away upstairs, I moved, fast but steady, searching drawers until my hand fell on a half-charred letter, insurance claim forms detailing the old Randall fire. My name was written there in smug ink, my father's barn listed as abandoned storage rather than primary asset. My knees failed. I knew then the fire hadn't only been vengeance, it had been business, a quiet extermination dressed as misfortune. That realization didn't feed revenge, it starved mercy. By sunrise I was gone, clutching that letter like salvation. When I reached home, I hid it in Mama's Bible beneath the page about forgiveness. Maybe I needed that irony to remind myself of the difference between divine justice and my own. That morning, as the first light cut across our ruined fields, I realized my fight was no longer about fire or family. It was about dignity, the kind no one could steal or burn again. And in that moment, I stopped being the daughter who mourned and became the woman who would make meaning from ashes, no matter whose sins she had to expose to do it. The hardest part of carrying a secret is pretending it weighs nothing. And for a whole season I walked through town beneath that burden as if it were no heavier than a shadow. The letter in Mama's Bible throbbed in my mind each time I saw the Merritts tip their hats from across the road, smug and clean, while my father coughed himself into the earth. When he died that November, I didn't cry at the graveside. Grief had become a dull blade by then, cutting only from the inside. Mama said the gods test those they plan to use. But I no longer believed in divine purpose, only deliberate ones. After the burial, I began writing, carefully copying the incriminating words from Thomas's hand, sending anonymous letters to the state commissioner and the local paper. I waited for weeks, but silence grows thicker in small towns when truth threatens men who buy it by the barrel. Finally, restless beyond reason, I took the matter into my own hands. I found an old recorder device from a traveling salesman who owed me a favor and learned to use it like it was another language. My plan was simple, reckless, and righteous. Make the Merritts confess again, only this time capture every word. On a Sunday afternoon in early winter, I invited Thomas's housekeeper, Miss Lorna, to tea and gently steered the talk to local gossip, then to her employer's past mistakes. Her hands shook when she admitted she'd overheard him speak freely once before. I promised her protection, though I had none to give, and together we plotted a night of truth-telling. When the hour came, the air was brittle with cold, and frost coated the fence rails like the quiet hand of fate. I hid beneath the window of his parlor with the recorder at my chest, hearing the murmur of voices drift through, the crunch of glass, the slur of whiskey, his laugh that still made my stomach twist. Then came words that no soul could mistake. If they'd signed the deal, there'd be no fire. A little smoke was cheaper than pride. That was it. Proof. I pressed the button, my hands trembling not from cold, but from deliverance itself. The next morning, I carried the device to the sheriff's office, my heart beating like gunfire. Yet the sheriff was already there waiting, smile thin as wire, a Merritt man through and through. He listened, nodded, then quietly locked the evidence away, saying he'd look into it. I knew then that justice was not blind in our county, it was bought. Despair would have crushed me if not for the sudden, hard clarity that rose in its place. Systems fail, but stories endure. If I could not bring the Merritts to court, I would bring them to history. I began writing at night by oil lamp, turning truth into narrative, disguised names, familiar sins, and sent the story to a paper over in St. Louis under a false signature. Weeks later, the article appeared, and though the town never said my name aloud, I felt the shift ripple through its silence. The Merritts stopped smiling then. Some neighbors whispered that justice has many faces, and maybe mine was one of them. The barn was gone, my family reduced to soil and smoke, but through the telling I felt my soul begin to rebuild its walls. I had turned ruin into testimony, loss into purpose, and while the fire took our past, it gave me something far more enduring, the calling to bear witness, to ensure that no truth however small, should die buried under ash again. The story's publication did not burn as bright as I expected. It did not bring sirens or confession. It burned quiet, slow, and dangerous, seeping through gossip like smoke through cracks in wood. For a month the town pretended not to read it, as if ignoring truth could unwrite it. But soon the ripple found its victims. The Merit Supply wagons were stopped on back roads by men who no longer trusted them, their credit denied at banks that once bowed before them. Thomas began to drink harder, disappear longer, while Samuel grew sickly and gaunt behind shuttered windows. I passed him once in the post office, his hat low, his face hollow with something past fear. He nodded without recognition, though part of me thought he might have known deep down who had written the words that undid him. That winter, justice took on the shape of decay, slow and precise, and still I found no peace. My hands shook when I milked the cows that remained, and every crackle of the hearth made me jerk, half expecting fire again, half wishing for it to finish what it began. Mama aged 10 years in one, the weight of secrecy heavy on her. She knew by then. I saw it in her eyes when she found the carbon paper and clippings in my chest. She didn't scold me. She only said, "Child, even truth can scorch if it's not tended right." But tending was beyond me. Guilt and triumph wrestled inside, and both left scars. That spring, word came that Thomas Merritt had vanished. Some said he ran off to Texas. Others whispered that he met the same river he'd used to hide his sins. I rode out one dawn to the place where I'd once found his flask. The water was high and cold, carrying broken branches from upstream, and when I saw a dark coat snagged against driftwood, I closed my eyes. I did not touch it. Death, I had learned, doesn't require witnesses. It only demands silence. I returned home and found Mama sitting by the old foundation of our barn, sewing by light she did not need. She said she dreamed of rebuilding it, same boards, same beams, though her hands trembled too much for a hammer. We never did rebuild. Some ruins are meant to stay visible, reminders to anyone passing by that truth has its own gravity. The years wore on, and the country changed, engines roaring where wind once ruled. New families moved in, never asking about the black streak patch of land down by the creek. Though sometimes their children came home spooked by a woman they swore they'd seen standing there at sunset, hair wild, eyes red like cinders. Maybe memory itself haunted that place. As for me, I left to join a war nursing corps when 20 came calling, thinking that perhaps healing strangers would heal something in me. Across oceans, I watched young men burn under skies different but familiar, and I understood then that fire follows us all, whether by malice or fate. I wrote letters for the dying, whole lives on small paper, and each time I signed a name that wasn't mine, I felt some small portion of that barn smoke leave my lungs. When the war ended, I came home older than my years, found Mama gone, her needle threaded neatly through unfinished cloth. Standing over her grave, I realized I could grieve without anger for the first time. The fire had taken our past, yes, but in its terrible mercy it had also reshaped me, from a child of soot into a keeper of stories. A barn once stood there. Now I stood in its place, grounded not in timber but in truth, ready to tell the tale so no one would ever forget that from every burning comes a purpose, and from every loss, a voice strong enough to speak for the dead. It was near the end of that decade when I realized the land itself remembered far better than any human heart could. Every spring the ash-drenched soil around the old barn foundation would bloom with stubborn color. Wild irises, buttercups, weeds with names I never bothered to learn, all rising from earth that should have stayed barren. I took it as a message, though from whom I could never tell. Sometimes near twilight, I'd catch the faint whinny of a horse long gone, or see the shimmer of heat above the ground even on cool days, as if the memory of flame still breathed beneath. I started visiting the spot each evening, bringing a chair and my notebook, talking to the ghosts I once tried to avenge. And then, after so many years, something happened that shook the quiet rhythm of my old age. A young man arrived at my door, hat in hand, saying his name was Henry Merritt, Thomas's grandson. I felt the name like a spark on dry tinder. He was nothing like his kin, soft-spoken, eyes clear, voice carrying no pride. He'd come to ask about the truth of that story, the one I'd written back when I thought justice meant retribution. He said his mother had always told him the fire ruined their family, that greed had cursed their blood, and he wanted to understand. I studied him a long time before speaking, reading not just his face, but the ghost of his grandfather buried beneath it. And then, for reasons I can't explain, I motioned him to sit. We talked for hours, 2 generations of enemies untangling a knot of lies passed down like heirlooms. He told me how his father drank himself to ruin, how the Merritt land was sold to pay debts, how he'd left town to find honest work as a carpenter. I told him the rest, the truth stripped of fury, not to wound, but to warn. When I finished, he sat silent for a long while, then said something that eased a weight I hadn't known I still carried. Ma'am, sometimes what we inherit isn't guilt or glory. It's the chance to do better. Those words felt like sunlight breaking through decades of gray. Before he left, he pressed something into my palm, a carved wooden bird, rough but beautiful. Made from the beams of our old barn, he said softly. Your barn too. Maybe if stories can mingle. After he rode away, I stood at the window until sunset painted the horizon the same color as old fire. My hands trembled around the carving. I hadn't realized how much grace I still needed. That night I dreamed of my father smiling from the shadows, Mama singing by the hearth, Henry laughing from the hayloft, all of them whole and unburned. When I woke, I walked to the ruins one last time, buried the wooden bird deep in the soil where the heart of the barn once stood, and whispered a prayer not for vengeance or victory, but for balance. The dawn that followed felt impossibly clean, the air crisp with forgiveness. Maybe the land had waited for that, or maybe I had. As I turned to go, I knew the story was complete. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but truly. The fire had been the cruelest of teachers, yet without it I might never have learned the language of purpose, or the small, stubborn miracle of peace that comes when you stop running from your own ghosts and finally learn to walk beside them. Time has a strange way of softening the outlines of tragedy while sharpening the meaning behind it. And as the years bent my spine and silvered my hair, I began to understand that survival isn't measured by how well you forget, but by how fiercely you remember. After Mama passed, I moved into the small house near Dawson Creek, where harvest fields could still whisper of our land's ghosts. I took to keeping journals, notebooks scrawled with fragments of memory, confessions folded between pages like pressed flowers, each one carrying the scent of smoke and forgiveness. The world marched on. Radios filled the air once owned by silence. Highways sliced through wild fields, and young folks no longer believed in hard hands or long sorrows. Still, I could not escape the pull of that night, the shape of the flames leaping like language only my heart could read. One afternoon, a wandering journalist stopped by, saying he'd heard rumors of the girl who brought down the Merricks. He carried his arrogance neatly pressed into his suit, and though his questions were polite, I saw in his eyes that he sought sensation, not truth. I told him what I wanted remembered, the part where loss turns to lesson, where silence becomes voice, and nothing of the pain that nearly killed me. But when he left, he took something else too, the spark of purpose I thought had long gone cold. The following weeks I wrote again, not for papers, not for justice, but for souls yet unborn who might one day wonder if their own suffering meant anything. I wanted them to know it could. I wrote through winter storms until the ink froze in the nib, through springs when the barn's foundation bloomed with wild forget-me-nots, through summers when thunder rolled like echoes of that ancient blaze. And in telling, I reshaped my guilt into grace. Yet life, ever impatient, wasn't done testing me. One evening a woman arrived at my door, a frightened girl no older than I had been when the fire took everything. She said her husband drank and hit her, that people in town said I once fought men more powerful than God himself. Her words broke something tender inside me, something that had rested too long. For the first time in decades, I left my chair by the window and stood as if called to battle again. I took her in, fed her, told her stories of mercy hidden inside vengeance, how rage can carve rooms for courage if you guide its flame right. Through her eyes I saw my own youth revived, bruised but unbroken. Together we mended quilts and old fences, and the parts of ourselves we thought beyond repair. The neighbors whispered again, as small towns always do, saying the old Randall widow was harboring scandal, but I let them talk. They had never learned that what they called rebellion was really redemption wearing its working clothes. Seasons turned, And in time the girl moved on, stronger and steady, her laughter leaving a trail of warmth that outshone any fire. As I watched her go down that dusty road, I understood at last the truest meaning of what the flames had left me. A calling not to punish, but to rebuild from ruin, to turn ash into soil for others to stand upon. That barn fire took our past. It stole faces, names, histories, but it also lit a torch I've kept burning all my life, the kind that doesn't destroy but illuminates paths for those lost in darkness. Even now, as I sit in this rocking chair watching dusk melt into the fields, I can still smell the ghost of smoke when the wind turns right, and I whisper a quiet thanks to fate, to fire, to time. That from destruction came the purpose that made living worth all its costs. Years drifted on like the slow current of Dawson Creek, carrying away pieces of me I no longer needed, and leaving behind those too rooted to move. I grew into old age quietly, without fanfare, though the world around me roared into new eras of noise and change. The town built paved roads, electric lamps replaced oil, and strangers settled in houses whose porches faced the same endless horizon I once feared. Yet through all that noise, I still heard the language of silence, the voice of memory humming in the earth where everything began. The ruins of our barn had long since sunk into the land, swallowed by grass and time. But now and then someone would stop by to ask about it, usually a traveler with a curious eye or a child chasing stories heard from a grandparent. I told them only fragments, never the full truth, because some tales lose their power when told too easily. Around my 85th year, a young woman from the city came, saying she was writing a book on local legends. She called me Miss Randall, though few had used my maiden name in half a century. She spoke fast, full of ambition and questions, and when she asked about the fire, my first instinct was to protect it, to hold the secret as one protects the last coal of a dying fire. But her sincerity softened me, the same way youth always disarms the weary. I poured her tea, set out old photographs saved from other lives, and began to speak, not as a victim or even a survivor, but as a keeper. As I told her about the night the barn burned, the smell of wet hay and molten iron, the sound of my father shouting my name through smoke, I saw in her eyes the same wonder that first took me when I realized loss could become legacy. She listened as though every word were a seed, and I realized then that my story would not end with me. When she left, she promised to come back with copies of what she'd written, but months passed and no word came. I expected disappointment, yet one autumn morning a letter arrived postmarked from New York. Inside was a manuscript, the first draft of her book. She called it Ashes and Purpose, and though she changed the names, I saw our lives stitched into every page, our fire reborn in print. I cried for the first time in decades, not from grief, but from gratitude, because finally the story that began in destruction had found a home beyond me. Later that year, during the first snow, I felt my health begin to fade. The days blurred like candlelight in wind, yet I found no fear waiting. Every time the snow fell, It looked less like loss and more like cleansing, soft white over blackened ground. I wrote one last entry in my journal, just a single line. What the fire took, time restored in truth. And that night, as the world fell silent except for the whisper of flakes against the window, I closed my eyes and saw the barn hole again. The stalls alive with breath, the rafters ringing with laughter, Mama humming, Papa smiling, Henry waving from the hayloft. For the first time in my long life, I felt warm without any flame at all. They found me 2 days later, sitting in the chair by the window with my journal open on my lap, as though waiting for the final sentence to drift in from somewhere beyond the horizon. The house smelled faintly of lilac and rain, and the teapot still steamed beside me. They said I looked peaceful, like someone who had remembered how to rest at last. The young woman from New York arrived weeks later, too late for goodbyes, but early enough to hear what the townsfolk whispered, that the old Randall woman had died with a smile. She stayed a few days, walking the land I once worked, visiting the place where the barn had stood. When she came to my grave, they say she knelt, reading aloud from her finished book, until dusk fell and wild geese crossed the fading sky. Her words carried through the evening like a benediction, scattering across the same fields that had once smoked with ruin. Perhaps that was how my story was supposed to end, not with vengeance or regret, but with the gentle passing of a voice from one soul to another. For long after my body was gone, the story lived. Children told it around porch lights, the way old hymns were once sung in church halls, and travelers who passed through Dawson Creek said they often saw a figure by the riverside when the wind turned hot and restless, as though the memory of fire itself still lingered, keeping silent watch. I like to think that somewhere within that echo of heat, my spirit lingers too, not to frighten, but to remind. The barn that burned, the ashes that fed the soil, the pain that forged a purpose, none of it belonged to me alone. It was the rhythm of life itself, the endless cycle of losing, learning, and leaving something behind worth remembering. I once believed the fire had stolen everything, but it had only cleared the space for truth to take root. Every scar became a story, every silence a kind of prayer. And so when the snow melts each spring and wildflowers rise again from the blackened ground, maybe that's me whispering through them, that no loss is wasted, that no flame burns forever, and that sometimes the only way to see clearly is to stand in the light of what once destroyed you. And in that light, I am still there, old, unbroken, eternal, guarding the ashes, grateful to have learned that when the past turns to smoke, the soul can finally breathe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the familiar fields I had tended all my life, I felt a rare, profound peace settle within me. A quiet acceptance that the fire, with all its fury and destruction, had finally brought me to this moment of understanding. That true purpose emerges not from clinging to what is lost, but from the grace of letting it go and finding new life in its absence. I had spent a lifetime weaving my pain into stories and my scars into strength, And now I knew that the greatest victory was not in reversing the past, but in transforming it into a legacy that would outlast even the ashes of that barn. As I closed my eyes for the final time, I saw once more the vibrant land I loved, free of smoke, alive with hope, and I whispered my gratitude to the winds, knowing that my soul was forever woven into the wind song. The years had been my crucible, and in the end I was healed, not despite the flames, but because of them, for they had carved within me a purpose unending, a testament that the light we carry is often born from the darkest night. And in the silence that followed, I was at peace, for I had learned that even in destruction, there is a beginning, an everlasting promise that from the ashes of the past, a brighter future is born.